October 14th, 1942. Pacific Ocean. Dawn's pale light glints off steel, illuminating a giant battleship that dominates the horizon. Waves crash against its hull with a rhythmic insistence. Yet beneath the imposing silhouette, a tension lingers. Sailors hurry along the deck, boots clanging against metal, breaths forming clouds in the humid morning air. Cannons sit like dormant predators, barrels pointed toward the sea, polished but eerily still. Officers bend over maps, pointing at enemy positions far beyond the visible horizon. Radios crackle with static, relaying distant reports of carriers, submarines, and scouting planes. The ship, a marvel of industrial ambition, embodies American pride. But even as it moves forward with deliberate power, a subtle unease grips the crew. Somewhere to the east, the shadow of enemy aircraft looms. Invisible, relentless, and faster than any gun this ship carries. Steel and armor might withstand shells, but they cannot outpace the evolving nature of naval warfare. The battleship's reputation precedes it, feared, respected, celebrated. But history, as it will soon show, has a different judgment in mind. In 7 minutes of night action, 9 hits would decide its fate in ways no amount of tonnage or firepower could anticipate. And in those moments, the illusion of invincibility begins to crack, revealing the gulf between perception and reality. By 1941, the United States had emerged as an industrial powerhouse, capable of producing warships on a scale unmatched in history. Battleships, monuments of steel, firepower, and national pride, were seen as the ultimate symbol of naval supremacy. Among them, one ship stood out in the minds of American planners and the public alike, a vessel of immense size, bristling with guns and touted as invincible. Its reputation was carefully cultivated through headlines, newsreels, and press releases, each emphasizing tonnage, armor thickness, and sheer firepower. Yet by the time the United States entered World War II, the battleship paradigm was already shifting. Aircraft carriers, long-range reconnaissance planes, and submarines were rewriting the rules of naval warfare. The vast guns of these behemoths could dominate a traditional line of battle engagement, but battles in the Pacific were rarely fought on textbook lines. The open ocean, the reach of carrier-based planes, and the speed of Japanese strike tactics began to expose limitations that textbooks could not anticipate. At Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, the vulnerability of even the most heavily armored ships became clear. Battleships that once symbolized ultimate naval might were suddenly sitting ducks against aerial assault. Damage control, anti-aircraft guns, and crew training could only do so much against waves of fast, determined aircraft. In this environment, the mythos of the American battleship faced its first real challenge, not through gunnery duels, but from the invisible menace of the sky. The ship in question had already taken part in several early operations in the Pacific theater, including escorting convoys and providing bombardment support for island campaigns. Its presence was often cited as a deterrent, with commanders assuming that the mere sight of its guns would influence Japanese movements. In reality, much of its time was spent in passive roles, a symbol of strength rather than an active participant in decisive engagements. Crews trained relentlessly, drills repeated daily to maintain combat readiness. But actual combat opportunities were rare, and when they came, success relied heavily on coordination with carriers and other ships, not raw firepower alone. By mid-1942, American naval intelligence was piecing together the Japanese order of battle, noting the strengths and weaknesses of individual vessels. Reports emphasized speed, maneuverability, and anti-aircraft capability, attributes where traditional battleships often lagged. In night operations or surprise attacks, these ships were slower to react, relying on radar guidance and firing solutions that, while advanced for the time, could not always compensate for human error or the chaos of battle. This was particularly critical in the Solomons and around the Bismarck Sea, where rapid Japanese strikes had already caught larger vessels off guard. Public perception, however, remained enamored with armor and calibers. Headlines proclaimed victories and emphasized shell counts, even when the strategic significance was limited. The battleship's image became a tool of morale, both at home and among the fleet, masking the evolving reality of naval warfare. Naval planners and admirals, many trained in pre-war doctrines, struggled to reconcile the promise of these ships with the tactical demands of a war increasingly dominated by aircraft. Amid these tensions, the stage was set for a critical test. The ship would face an engagement unlike any it had experienced before, a night battle where radar, coordination, and speed would determine the outcome. The conventional metrics of tonnage, armor, and gun calibers would be tested against the evolving art of naval combat, revealing how much of its reputation rested on perception rather than performance. The crews prepared without knowing the full stakes. Officers studied charts, marking enemy positions, while gunners checked their equipment and verified firing ranges. The ship moved steadily, slicing through the Pacific waters, a steel giant moving toward confrontation. Yet beneath the confidence instilled by past drills and public acclaim, subtle doubts lingered. The modern war demanded more than the raw might of a battleship. It demanded adaptability, precision, and the ability to respond in seconds, often before human reaction could keep pace. And as night fell over the vast Pacific, these doubts would soon become stark reality, setting the scene for an engagement that would challenge every assumption about power, prestige, and naval supremacy. By late 1942, the Pacific theater had evolved into a labyrinth of island chains, coral reefs, and treacherous channels. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese forces were shifting strategy, relying on fast destroyers, cruisers, and well-coordinated airstrikes to strike before the U.S. Navy could bring its superior firepower to bear. Night operations, long avoided in earlier campaigns, were becoming a central tactic for Tokyo's planners, exploiting the U.S. Navy's limited experience with nocturnal engagements. The American battleship, while formidable, was now entering a world where radar technology and coordination would determine survival. Its gun directors had been upgraded with the latest fire control radars, state-of-the-art systems that could track enemy vessels at night or through fog. Yet these instruments required highly trained operators, and in the chaos of battle, human judgment remained as crucial as any machine. The crews practiced tirelessly, running simulated exercises under dim deck lights, calibrating their guns to account for distance, speed, and trajectory. Every calculation mattered. One misstep could mean the difference between a clean hit and a wasted salvo. Japanese forces were well aware of American capabilities. Scouts had noted the battleship's strengths: thick armor, massive main guns, and a crew drilled for gunnery excellence. But they also identified weaknesses: slower maneuverability, limited anti-aircraft coverage in certain sectors, and a heavy reliance on radar-guided firing at night. Japanese captains planned to exploit these vulnerabilities with swift, coordinated strikes. The NI-GHD battle that awaited would test whether raw firepower could match tactical cunning and timing. As the U.S. task force advanced, tension aboard the battleship was palpable. Officers reviewed charts repeatedly, plotting courses through narrow channels and avoiding shallow reefs. Lookouts scanned the horizon with binoculars, peering into darkness for any glimmer of enemy lights or radar reflections. The Pacific was deceptively calm. The gentle sway of waves belied the violence that would erupt within hours. Sailors, though trained for combat, felt the edge of apprehension, aware that this battle was not simply a drill, but a true test of their ship's reputation and the Navy's evolving doctrine. Strategically, this engagement was critical. Intelligence indicated that Japanese cruisers and destroyers were attempting to reinforce positions on the Solomon Islands. Intercepting them could prevent further consolidation and protect vulnerable supply lines. For the American Navy, demonstrating that battleships could still dominate, despite growing carrier prominence, was as much about morale as it was about sinking enemy vessels. Newspapers and radio broadcasts had long painted these ships as symbols of American might. Now, reality would either confirm or challenge that narrative. The approaching night added layers of complexity. Darkness concealed movements, limited visual range, and heightened the importance of radar accuracy. Officers held briefing after briefing, stressing coordination with destroyers and cruisers in the task force, establishing communication protocols, and rehearsing contingency plans. Every gun crew had its assigned sectors, every lookout a designated sweep, every radar operator a set of targets. The ship's captain understood that the coming engagement would be won not by individual heroism, but by disciplined, synchronized action, an orchestration of men and machines under the cover of night. Weather conditions further complicated matters. Clouds hung low over the ocean, diffusing moonlight and creating pockets of shadow. Mist rolled off the waves, dampening sound, but also limiting visibility. The battleship's enormous silhouette loomed like a phantom against the horizon, visible only to those scanning carefully with radar or moonlit outlines. These conditions would become crucial in the night engagement, influencing detection, targeting, and maneuvering for both sides. As the Japanese fleet drew closer, the stage was set. Every drill, every calculation, every strategic assumption would now be tested. The massive guns, the thick armor, and the radar systems, all the elements that had created the ship's legendary reputation, would face a challenge that went beyond theory or training. The coming engagement promised to be a clash not only of steel and firepower, but of doctrine, technology, and human resolve. The tension was almost tangible, a quiet calm before a storm that would erupt in minutes. The battleship, a symbol of might and national pride, sailed into the night, unaware that what awaited would not only define its legacy, but also challenge the very notion of what made a battleship formidable in modern warfare. Human cost technology versus expectation, leadership under illusion. A battleship is often remembered as steel and statistics. Displacement, gun caliber, armor thickness. But inside the hull, beneath the armor belts and gun turrets, it was a floating city of men. Most of the crew aboard America's newest battleships in 1942 were young. Farm boys, factory hands, college dropouts. Many had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, trained at breakneck speed, and were now standing watch in the middle of the Pacific. Their days followed rigid routines, maintenance, drills, inspections, but at night thoughts drifted. Letters from home, rumors from the radio room, the quiet fear that the next alarm would not be a drill. Life aboard a battleship was exhausting even without combat. The ship vibrated constantly. Turrets thundered during gunnery practice. Compartments smelled of oil, sweat, paint, and cordite. Sailors slept in stacked bunks barely wide enough to turn over. Yet morale remained high, fed by one powerful belief. This ship was nearly invincible. That belief mattered, and it would shape what followed. From the moment the battleship entered service, it was presented to the public and to its own crew as the ultimate expression of naval power. Thick armor that could shrug off enemy shells. Main guns that could reach farther than anything afloat. A floating fortress designed to dominate any surface engagement. For the men aboard, this narrative became psychological armor. They trusted the ship. They trusted the steel around them. They believed that if things went wrong, the ship would endure. But war rarely respects reputation. Technologically, the battleship represented both the peak and the problem of American naval thinking. Its designers had built it to fight other battleships, to trade heavy blows at long range, under clear skies, in decisive fleet engagements. Every system on board reflected this assumption. The armor scheme favored protection against plunging shell fire. Fire control systems were optimized for surface gunnery. Even its internal layout reflected expectations of how future wars would be fought. Yet the Pacific War was not unfolding that way. By 1942, the battle space had shifted. Air power dictated movement. Submarines hunted silently beneath the waves. Night engagements, once rare, were becoming routine. Fast destroyers and cruisers struck suddenly, fired torpedoes, and vanished into darkness. The battleship's massive guns mattered less if the enemy never presented a clear target. Radar was supposed to bridge that gap. American naval radar in 1942 was revolutionary, but immature. The equipment could detect contacts beyond visual range, but interpreting those signals required experience. Returns overlapped. Sea clutter created false echoes. Friend and foe could blur together on a glowing screen. In theory, radar gave the battleship eyes in the dark. In practice, it introduced a new dependency, one that demanded flawless coordination between operators, gunnery officers, and bridge commanders. That coordination rested on leadership. The ship's commanding officers were seasoned professionals, many trained in a pre-war Navy that still revered battleship doctrine. They had spent careers mastering gunnery tables, fleet formations, and command hierarchies built around capital ships. The battleship was not just a weapon. It was the centerpiece of naval identity. Questioning its effectiveness was almost unthinkable. In briefings before the engagement, confidence dominated the tone. The ship's firepower was emphasized. Its radar advantage was highlighted. The enemy was acknowledged, but often underestimated. Japanese night fighting skill, honed through years of training, was known in theory, but its implications were not fully absorbed. Intelligence reports described enemy destroyers and cruisers, but rarely framed them as existential threats to a battleship. This was not arrogance. It was institutional momentum. Doctrine shapes perception. Leaders see the battlefield through the lens of what they have been taught to value. For decades, that lens placed battleships at the center of naval warfare. Even as carriers proved decisive, the belief persisted that when fleets finally met at night or in confined waters, the battleship would reassert itself. That belief influenced decisions, how aggressively to maneuver, how close to close with the enemy, how much risk to accept. It also influenced how warnings were interpreted. A radar contact might be dismissed as distant. A destroyer threat might be considered manageable. After all, this ship had armor measured in feet, not inches. Yet the enemy saw something different. To Japanese commanders, the battleship was not an invincible symbol. It was a target. Large, predictable, slow to react. They had studied American designs carefully, and they understood that torpedoes, not shells, offered the greatest chance of success. Their doctrine emphasized coordinated attacks, precise timing, and the use of darkness as a weapon. The two sides were approaching the same battle with entirely different assumptions. Inside the American battleship, sailors prepared for a gunnery duel. Outside, the enemy prepared for an ambush. As the fleets closed, the gap between expectation and reality narrowed. Radar screens filled with contacts. Orders came faster. Engines changed pitch. Somewhere ahead, unseen in the darkness, Japanese ships were already positioning themselves. What would decide the battle was no longer armor thickness or gun caliber, but whose assumptions would collapse first. And that question leads directly to the remaining angles. The enemy's doctrine, the tactical environment of night combat, and the moral weight of placing faith in a symbol that may no longer fit the war it was built to fight. The enemy's eye night as a weapon, the weight of a symbol. From a Japanese perspective, the American battleship was not a mystery. It was a known quantity. Long before the war began, Imperial Japanese Navy planners had studied U.S. naval construction in detail. Displacement figures were estimated. Armor schemes were analyzed. Gun calibers were cataloged. The battleship's strengths were understood, but so were its limitations. Japanese doctrine never assumed that heavy armor made a ship immune. Instead, it focused on how to bypass armor entirely. Torpedoes were the answer. By 1942, Japanese naval torpedoes were among the most advanced in the world. Long-ranged, fast, and carrying massive warheads, they were designed to cripple capital ships with a single well-placed hit. Japanese crews trained relentlessly in night attacks, often operating without radar, relying on optics, timing, and formation discipline. Darkness was not a hindrance, it was protection. To them, an American battleship sailing at night was not a fortress. It was an opportunity. Japanese commanders understood that battleships were least effective when surprised. Their main guns required time to traverse, and calculate firing solutions. Their size made evasive maneuver slow. Their crews, though disciplined, were still adapting to radar-guided night combat. If an attack could be launched before the battleship fully understood the situation, the advantage shifted dramatically. The battlefield itself amplified these factors. Night naval combat in the Pacific was chaotic by nature. Visibility was limited. Distances were deceptive. Engine noise carried across water. Muzzle flashes could reveal a ship's position instantly. Commanders had seconds, not minutes, to interpret fragmentary information and issue orders that could not be easily reversed. In such conditions, the battleship's greatest strength, its firepower, could become irrelevant. A destroyer did not need to win a gunnery duel. It only needed to survive long enough to launch torpedoes. A cruiser did not need to penetrate armor. It only needed to force evasive maneuvers that disrupted formation and exposed vulnerabilities. Japanese ships were trained to work together in these moments, overlapping fields of fire and coordinating attacks without relying on centralized control. American doctrine emphasized order. Japanese doctrine embraced controlled chaos. This difference mattered profoundly. For the American battleship, every decision carried moral and symbolic weight. The ship was not just another unit in the task force. It was a statement, a visible commitment of national industrial power, a reassurance to allies, a warning to enemies. Losing such a ship was unthinkable not only tactically, but psychologically. That reality influenced how risk was assessed. Commanders were conscious, sometimes unconsciously, of what the ship represented. Aggressive maneuvers had to be balanced against the consequences of damage. Retreat could be interpreted as weakness. Advancing could invite disaster. Every course change carried political and strategic implications beyond the immediate fight. Meanwhile, Japanese commanders faced no such burden. They knew they were outmatched industrially. They knew American shipyards could replace losses faster than Japan ever could. Their advantage lay in inflicting disproportionate damage early, before that industrial weight could fully assert itself. Damaging or sinking a battleship was not merely a tactical success. It was a psychological blow. It proved that American naval power was not invulnerable. This asymmetry shaped behavior on both sides. American commanders sought decisive engagement that would justify the battleship's presence. Japanese commanders sought disruption, confusion, damage, and withdrawal before daylight exposed them to air attack. As the night deepened, these philosophies collided. Radar contacts multiplied. Bearings were called out. Ranges closed faster than expected. The battleship's bridge became a place of rapid calculation and restrained tension. Every officer understood that once firing began, the situation would escalate beyond control. Somewhere ahead, Japanese ships were already turning into attack courses. Torpedoes were being readied. Lookouts strained their eyes against the darkness, searching for silhouettes that might only appear for seconds. The battleship was about to be tested, not against the image it projected, but against the war as it truly was in 1942. What followed would not be decided by reputation or even by preparation alone. It would be decided in minutes, by the speed of perception, the clarity of command, and the unforgiving geometry of steel and explosives in the dark. And in that narrow window, the idea of the battleship itself would be put on trial. The moment of decision was approaching. Night contact, radar shadows, 7 minutes that changed everything. November 14th, 1942. Iron Bottom Sound. Just after midnight. The sea is black and restless, reflecting no moon, no stars. Only the faint glow of distant fires burning on Guadalcanal's shore. The air smells of fuel oil and cordite, remnants of earlier fighting. Somewhere in the darkness, engines beat steadily, measured and deliberate. On the bridge of the American battleship, radar screens flicker with ghostly returns. Pale blips slide across the scopes, marking shapes that human eyes cannot yet see. Operators call out bearings and ranges, voices calm but tight. Contacts are real now, no longer theoretical, no longer distant. The enemy is close. This is not how battleships were imagined to fight when their keels were laid down. No long-range daylight duel. No clear horizon. No elegant exchange of salvos between giants. Instead, the battle forms in fragments, partial information, overlapping signals, and seconds of uncertainty. Orders move quickly but cautiously. The battleship holds formation, its massive hull slicing through the water at speed. Turrets are trained forward, elevation adjusted, firing solutions continuously recalculated. Radar data feeds the fire control system, converting invisible echoes into angles and numbers. This technology, new, untested in combat at this scale, has become the ship's eyes. Ahead, Japanese ships maneuver silently. They do not broadcast radar pulses. They do not announce themselves. They turn by instinct and training, aligning for attack runs practiced countless times in peacetime drills. Destroyers slip outward, widening the formation. Cruisers adjust speed, holding just beyond visual range. Their goal is simple: get close enough. At approximately 0:06 hours, the situation crystallizes. Radar contacts converge. Distances collapse rapidly. The battleship's bridge is now alive with overlapping commands, course adjustments, speed changes, firing priorities. Lookouts strain against the darkness, finally catching fleeting glimpses. Low silhouettes, quick flashes of foam, the suggestion of superstructures against black water. The first guns open fire. Not the battleship's main battery, but lighter weapons. Secondary guns bark into the night. Muzzle flashes briefly illuminating sections of the ship in stark white light. The darkness responds instantly. Japanese guns answer back, shells streaking unseen until they strike water or steel. The battle is no longer abstract. It is happening now. At 0:10 hours, the battleship's main guns receive a firing solution. Massive turrets rotate with mechanical steadiness, each movement slow but unstoppable. Inside the turrets, crews brace themselves, muscles tense, ears ringing even before the blast. The order comes. The first salvo erupts with a thunder that seems to tear the night apart. Flames leap from the muzzles, briefly silhouetting the ship against its own fire. Shockwaves ripple across the water. Empty shell casings crash inside the turret, while smoke pours outward, obscuring everything for seconds. Radar confirms hits. Not guesses. Not hopes. Hits. Japanese ships are caught in the open, illuminated by gunfire and explosions. One silhouette staggers, its course faltering. Another disappears momentarily behind towering columns of water thrown up by near misses. The battleship fires again, adjusting aim with machine precision, guided not by sight but by reflected radio waves. This is the moment the battleship was built for, or so it seems. Within minutes, multiple salvos land. Steel meets steel at impossible speeds. Armor is tested. Superstructures erupt in sparks and flame. Japanese crews fight to respond, launching torpedoes even as shells tear through decks and bulkheads. But the night does not belong to one side alone. As the battleship concentrates on gunnery, unseen dangers close in. Torpedoes are already in the water, running silent, their wakes invisible in the dark. Each one carries enough explosive force to cripple even the largest ship afloat. The bridge does not yet know how many have been launched, or from where. Evasive maneuvers begin, limited by the ship's size, constrained by formation, cautious not to expose broadsides unnecessarily. Second stretch. Every officer understands what a single hit below the waterline could mean. The battleship continues firing, landing blow after blow. Radar shows one enemy contact slowing dramatically. Another fades altogether. The power of the guns is undeniable. In raw destructive terms, the battleship is winning. But victory in night combat is never clean. Smoke thickens. Radar returns grow cluttered. Friendly and enemy contacts intermingle. Secondary guns fire almost continuously now, their crews working in near darkness, sweat and cordite mixing in the air. The sea around the ship churns with shell, splashes, and debris. Then, without warning, the balance shifts. A sudden course change. A shouted warning. A shape crossing the bow. Somewhere ahead, torpedoes are second from their terminal run. The battleship's future is about to be decided, not by how many shells it has fired, but by whether it can avoid what it cannot see. And the next 7 minutes will determine whether reputation becomes legend or a liability. Steel in the dark. The illusion shatters. What 7 minutes revealed? 14 hours. The sea ahead erupts without warning. A white plume surges upward off the battleship's starboard quarter, close enough to be felt through the hull, close enough to send a vibration shuddering through steel decks. A torpedo detonates prematurely or passes just wide. No impact follows, but the message is unmistakable. They are inside the torpedo envelope now. On the bridge, course corrections come sharply. Rudder angles change. Speed fluctuates by knots at a time. The ship responds, but slowly. 45,000 tons does not turn quickly, no matter how skilled the helmsman. The battleship's momentum becomes both shield and burden. Another radar contact disappears. This one does not fade gradually. It vanishes. Fire control officers confirm what the screens imply. One Japanese capital ship, likely a cruiser, has been catastrophically hit. Flames now mark its position, a burning wound on the surface of the sea. The battleship's guns have done their work with brutal efficiency. 9 confirmed main battery hits. 7 minutes of firing. On paper, it is overwhelming success. Yet the ship remains in danger. Torpedoes continue running. Japanese destroyers, though damaged and disorganized, have already released their weapons and are breaking contact. Their job is done. Whether they survive no longer matters. The sea itself now carries their attack forward. Lookouts shout bearings. Secondary guns swivel, firing at shadows, wakes, anything that might suggest movement. The battleship weaves as much as its mass allows, throwing up white water along its flanks. Seconds pass, then more. No impact comes. One by one, the invisible threats either miss, detonate harmlessly, or run out of range. The battleship survives not through armor alone, but through timing, spacing, and the simple fortune that governs all naval combat. By 0:21 hours, the firing slackens. Radar screens show enemy contacts retreating, fragmenting, or simply gone. Smoke drifts across the water, blurring the boundary between fire and darkness. Burning wreckage illuminates the aftermath in brief, flickering pulses. The battleship reduces speed. Damage reports arrive from across the ship. Minor splinter damage. Shock effects. No flooding. No critical systems lost. Against expectations, against the logic of torpedo warfare, the ship remains intact. On the surface, this is victory. But the truth is more complex. The decisive damage was inflicted not because the battleship was invulnerable, but because the enemy's timing failed by narrow margins. Because radar functioned as intended. Because torpedoes missed by dozens of meters rather than meters. Because chance leaned briefly in one direction. And even so, the engagement exposes something undeniable. The battleship did not control the fight. It survived it. The enemy dictated range and timing. They forced the battleship to react rather than impose order. The ship's immense firepower proved lethal, but only when conditions aligned perfectly. Radar, not armor or guns, was the decisive factor. Without it, the outcome could have been catastrophic. As dawn approaches, the scale of what nearly happened begins to settle in. A single torpedo hit would have rewritten the story entirely. One flooded compartment, one damaged shaft, one loss of speed. The ship's size, once its greatest strength, would have become a trap. Instead, the battleship sails on, outwardly unchanged. But within naval command circles, the implications are already forming. This engagement will be studied not as proof of battleship dominance, but as evidence of how narrow the margin has become. How dependent even the largest warships are on technology, coordination, and uncontrollable variables. The 7 minutes of firing will be remembered. Yet the silence between torpedo runs, the moments where nothing happened, carry equal weight. They reveal how close power came to irrelevance, and how fragile reputation can be when measured against modern naval warfare. As the smoke thins and the sea calms, the battleship resumes its patrol. But the war around it is changing faster than steel can adapt. And in the wake of this night, questions will begin to surface, quietly at first, about whether battleships like this one still belong at the center of naval strategy. Those questions will shape everything that follows. Survival without supremacy reports, numbers, and recalculation. Daybreak reveals the battlefield in fragments. Oil slicks spread across Iron Bottom Sound, shimmering faintly in the early light. Debris drifts slowly, twisted metal, shattered planks, scattered equipment, silent evidence of the night's violence. Smoke still rises from the wreckage of Japanese ships, marking where radar contacts once moved with purpose and precision. The American battleship remains afloat and operational. Damage reports are compiled methodically. Minor splinter damage along the superstructure. Shock effects from near-miss detonations. No hull breaches below the waterline. No flooding in critical compartments. Casualties are limited compared to what might have been expected from a torpedo attack at close range. On paper, the ship has emerged victorious. One Japanese capital ship is confirmed sunk. Others are heavily damaged or forced to withdraw. The American task force maintains control of the waters for the moment, disrupting enemy plans to reinforce or bombard Guadalcanal. Strategically, the immediate objective has been achieved, but the tone of official reports is measured rather than celebratory. After-action assessments emphasize radar performance above all else. Fire control officers note that visual identification played a secondary role at best. Gunnery accuracy is praised, but always in conjunction with radar tracking and range calculation. Without those systems functioning as intended, the engagement would have devolved into blind firing. Torpedoes dominate the analysis. Intelligence officers estimate the number launched and reconstruct their likely tracks. Several passed dangerously close. At least one detonated within lethal distance. The conclusion is unavoidable. Survival hinged on avoidance, not resistance. Armor was never tested directly below the waterline, the place where even the thickest battleship protection was weakest. Commanders do not say this publicly. Instead, official communiques highlight the battleship's role as a stabilizing force. Its presence is credited with bolstering morale and discouraging further enemy action. The ship becomes a symbol once again, proof that American heavy units can fight and win at night. Privately, the language is more restrained. Naval planners recognize that this battle could not be repeated reliably. The conditions were unusually favorable. Radar superiority was absolute. Enemy coordination was disrupted earlier than expected. Timing favored the Americans by minutes, perhaps seconds. Such variables cannot be guaranteed. The engagement reinforces an uncomfortable reality already emerging elsewhere in the Pacific. Battleships do not dominate battles by default anymore. They require escorts, screening destroyers, air cover, and technological superiority simply to survive. Their power is conditional, situational, and increasingly dependent on forces outside their own hull. Meanwhile, aircraft carriers continue to reshape the war. Even as this night action is being analyzed, carrier-based air power remains the decisive factor across the theater. Daylight operations hinge on air superiority. Supply lines are threatened from hundreds of miles away. Battleships, no matter how powerful, cannot influence battles beyond the horizon without aircraft or radar support. The battleship survival does not reverse this trend. Instead, it sharpens the contrast. Here is a ship that performed flawlessly in a narrowly defined scenario, and yet nearly fell victim to a weapon designed specifically to nullify its strengths. Its victory is real, but its implications are limited. Among officers and analysts, a quiet reassessment begins. Not of the crew, whose performance is exemplary. Not of the technology, which proved invaluable, but of the concept itself. The question is not whether battleships can still fight. It is whether they justify the cost, the risk, and the strategic rigidity they impose. As the ship continues its patrols in the weeks that follow, it does so under a shifting doctrine. Increasingly, it operates in support roles, guarding carriers, bombarding shore positions, providing radar coverage and anti-aircraft fire. The age of independent battleship dominance is fading, not with a single catastrophic loss, but with engagements like this one, where survival feels closer to escape than triumph. And the full weight of that realization will only become clearer as the war grinds on. Reputation rewritten, strategic reality a giant relegated. In the months that follow, the battleship's legend grows louder than its influence. Newspapers and official briefings emphasize victory. Headlines focus on enemy losses and the precision of American gunnery. The image presented to the public is clear. A massive warship met the enemy in darkness and prevailed. For a nation still absorbing the shock of early defeats in the Pacific, the story is reassuring. Inside the Navy, the interpretation is more cautious. Training directives quietly evolve. Night engagements are no longer framed around battleship-led formations. Instead, destroyer screens and radar coordination take priority. Battleships are repositioned as anchors within larger systems rather than independent instruments of decision. Budget planners take note as well. A single battleship represents years of construction, millions of labor hours, and an extraordinary concentration of resources. Repairing even moderate damage ties up dockyards desperately needed for carriers, submarines, and escort vessels. When weighed against what aircraft carriers achieve with far less exposure, the cost-benefit balance shifts. Unmistakably, operational deployments reflect this change. The battleship increasingly serves as an escort, guarding carriers against surface threats, lending anti-aircraft firepower during air attacks, and delivering shore bombardment where its guns remain unmatched. These roles are valuable, but they are not decisive in the way battleship advocates once envisioned. The ship becomes powerful support, not strategic centerpiece. This transformation does not occur because the battleship failed in combat. It occurs because it succeeded only under conditions that no longer define modern war. Radar advantage, enemy miscalculation, and narrow timing windows cannot form the foundation of long-term strategy. Enemy planners understand this as well. Japanese naval doctrine does not shift toward confronting battleships directly after this engagement. Instead, emphasis remains on air attack, submarine warfare, and attritional pressure. The goal is no longer to defeat American capital ships in gunnery duels, but to make their presence increasingly irrelevant. Each carrier sunk or damaged matters more than any battleship engagement. As 1943 turns into 1944, the battleship sails through a war that has moved past it. Aircraft decide battles hundreds of miles from shore. Submarines strangle supply lines invisibly. Amphibious operations depend more on logistics and air cover than on surface gunfire. The battleship is still there, but rarely at the center. Historians will later debate its record. Some will point to this night action as proof that battleships were not obsolete, that they could still dominate when properly employed. Others will note how close the ship came to destruction and how little its survival altered the strategic trajectory of the war. Both views contain truth. What cannot be disputed is that this engagement did not restore the battleship's primacy. It did not change naval doctrine. It did not slow the rise of carrier warfare. Instead, it reinforced the idea that battleships had become situational tools, formidable but constrained. By war's end, the battleship will still exist in fleets around the world. Its guns will fire. Its decks will host ceremonies and surrenders. But its role will be fundamentally different from what designers once imagined. The night of 7 minutes and 9 hits will remain a defining episode. Not because it proved the battleship's supremacy, but because it revealed how narrowly that supremacy survived. And in that revelation lies the final meaning of the ship's story. A meaning that becomes clearest only when the guns fall silent. and history looks back with distance rather than awe. Power, perception, and the end of an era. History often remembers what survives, not what nearly fails. The American battleship at the center of this story did not sink. Its guns struck true. Its crew performed with discipline and precision under conditions few had ever faced before. By traditional measures of naval success, it earned its place in the record books. But war is not decided by moments alone. This ship's greatest contribution was not the destruction it inflicted, but the lesson it exposed. That even the most powerful warship afloat could no longer command the battlefield by presence alone. That survival depended less on armor and firepower than on information, coordination, and timing. That technology had quietly overtaken tradition. The battleship was not defeated by the enemy that night. It was surpassed by the war itself. Radar, aircraft, submarines, and logistics reshaped naval combat into something faster, farther-reaching, and less forgiving of mass and momentum. The qualities that once defined naval dominance, size, armor, heavy guns, became liabilities as often as strengths. Power without adaptability narrowed into risk. Calling this battleship overrated does not diminish the men who served aboard her. Their courage was real, their skill undeniable. The limitation lay not in human effort, but in the concept they were asked to embody. A concept born in an earlier era, tested in a new one. In 7 minutes of darkness, 9 shells found their mark. But the deeper impact unfolded slowly, across months and years, as fleets reorganized and doctrines shifted. By the time the war ended, victory belonged not to the biggest ships, but to the systems that connected sight, speed, and reach. The battleship endured, but no longer defined the future. And that is how eras end in war. Not with a single catastrophic loss, but with survival that no longer proves relevance. The steel giant sailed on. History quietly sailed past it,